before we start with our presentations, I want to invite Ivor Chipkin to share with us his opening remarks. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ivor.
Thank you, Rafael. Greetings from Johannesburg, and greetings to everyone else joining us from around the African continent and other parts of the world. It's a great pleasure to be joined by Rorisang and by Rorisang Lekalake and by Jacob Nato. So thank you very much for joining us on this panel to celebrate and to appreciate Africa Public Service Day. And the reason we wanted to have this conversation is because I think and to share, I think, some important news from South Africa, which is important both in South Africa itself, but also has potential consequences for colleagues around the African continent. And what I'm referring to is the passing into law on the 1st of April, not a joke, not April Fool's joke, a passing into law of a new piece of legislation which has profound consequences for the way in which the South African public service is and will be organized going forward. So that's really the occasion of today's event. And to begin to situate this discussion, which is happening in South Africa in relationship to other events and other developments across the African continent, to get a sense of what is happening elsewhere on the continent around public service reform. So that's really the context for today's discussion, and I'm looking very forward to the discussion and to the presentation from Jacob and from Rorisang. And Rafael, thank you very much for introducing this.
So thank you so much, Ivor. So before I ask you to start with your presentation yourself, I just want to give a very short introduction. We have today with us Rorisang Lekalake from Afrobarometer. She is the director of analysis of Afrobarometer. I understand that based in Cape Town, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Rorisang, please. And also Jacob Nato, which is our representative from the Kenya Institute for Public Research, Public Policy Research and Analysis. And we will start this presentation. We will have 20 minutes of presentation for each one of our invitees. Ivor is going to start presenting, and then we will have the presentations of Rorisang and then Jacob Nato. We are going to finish this with a session of questions and discussions. So please, we want your participation as well at the end of this time. So Ivor, please take a seat. I will show your presentation right now.
Thank you.
Just give me a minute.
Yeah. Fabulous. So thank you very much, and thank you everybody. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to explain a little bit about around what the legislation is and what it's going to do in South Africa. But I also want to discuss why I think it's especially important, both for its consequences for public administration and service delivery in South Africa, but also in relationship to how I think it's going to affect or change the nature of South African politics. And I'm drawing on two pieces of work. One is an essay my colleague and I have finished called Elite Contestation, and another piece on South Africa's third transition. And I'm calling this a third transition, that South Africa is entering a third transition, to give a sense of the significance of this development. So broadly speaking, if 1994 was the moment South Africa became a parliamentary democracy, 1996 was the moment we became a constitutional state, as the passing of South Africa's constitution. I'm suggesting that in 2026, South Africa has laid the foundations for a professional and relatively autonomous public administration. And what I want to discuss here is I'll introduce what the legislation does and why it's important, and I want to discuss it in relationship to developments in South African politics. And this is perhaps where I would like to start. So I want to play with this idea of elites or political elites, the changing configuration of political elites. And what I want to suggest is that the introduction of the Public Service Amendment Act, which is now passed, is potentially going to change the way in which elite contestation happens in South Africa. So two broad concepts coming from the fairly traditional elite studies literature is this notion of a power elite, a small cohesive group of individuals who hold dominant positions in the major institutions of society and have the power to make decisions with wide-ranging consequences. And as opposed to pluralism is a situation where in democratic societies, power is distributed amongst a wide array of interest groups and organizations so that it doesn't congeal in the hands of any particular small power elite or elite group. Traditionally, or in many parts of the world, not so much on the African continent, but in Asia and in Europe, the traditional route into the public, into the elite is varied, but the key institution that has played a role is that of educational institutions, which is why there is such contestation today around the elite universities in the US, around the Harvards and the Yales and the Columbias, around the Ivy League universities, because these really are and have been for a long time the major conduits into the American political elite, both in terms of economic positions in the senior leadership of the economy, but also within the estate. They are usually and largely speaking the graduates of these universities. And in that sense, the educational institutions, elite educational institutions, are the funnels through which one passes in order to access elite positions. There's a very similar situation in Asia and in other parts of the world. In South Africa, interestingly enough, that has not been, or that is not the primary route into elite positions. So even though our elite universities are important grounds or entry points into senior positions in the economy in particular, they are not the main conduits. They are not the main routes or the main conduits into elite positions inside the state. Of course, a certificate from an elite university is important, but it's not primarily important in terms of being selected or entering into the state. Raphael, can I see the next slide? Sorry, the one before. Going too quickly. Yeah. So in South Africa, I think in South Africa, that role of accessing elite position has largely fallen to the dominant political party. And in South Africa, of course, that's been the African National Congress until very recently, until last year's election. And maybe I'll come to that. Essentially, the route into senior positions, both in government and accessing resources in the government, has been through the African National Congress. And in that sense, what the literature in African studies has largely spoken about is the role in which the ANC plays as a gatekeeper to resources in the state. So this is where the Public Service Amendment Act becomes very, very interesting. In South Africa, there's been lots of discussion around cadre deployment, the way in which the ANC deliberately selects particular individuals for positions in key positions for employment in key positions in the state. But I don't think that the cadre deployment in and of itself is especially interesting. Rather, what underpins cadre deployment is a piece of legislation that has been in operative since 1994, which makes cadre deployment legal or possible in the first place. And this is the Public Service Act of 1994. In particular clauses of the Public Service Act, in particular Section 3 of the Public Service Act, administrative authority, especially in HR, and especially the authority to make appointments in government departments and to make operational decisions inside departments, has been vested with what's called the political executive inside departments, which basically means the politicians. So essentially in South Africa, the president of the country, ministers at cabinet level, national department level, and provincial cabinet ministers have had huge authority over administrative decisions, especially over the recruitment of staff and operational decisions inside departments. So if you're a director general, for example, or if you were a head of department, your powers your ability to exercise your role, perform in your role, were highly constrained by the legislative environment, which did not give you the powers or the authority to actually do your jobs. Rather, those powers vested with cabinet ministers at a provincial, national level, and even with the president, him or herself, which meant that in order to exercise or perform your role, you needed to have those powers delegated to you by the particular political executive. And this set up over a long period of time, over the last 30 years, tremendous tension and conflict within our departments between senior officials, director generals and heads of departments, and the political executive over the exercise of the basic functions, administrative functions in departments. Often there's been a situation of tremendous conflict between the director general and the minister, and or the Director General has been a pliant deployee of a cabinet minister. So either DGs have just been instruments of the political decisions of the minister, or there's been tremendous conflict. Essentially, what we have not had in South Africa is a clear distinction between the political role of the executive and the administrative role of the Director General. A blurring of the lines, if you like, between political office and administrative office. And I think this has been at the heart of many difficulties in South Africa. I think it's also played an absolutely key role in elite formation in South Africa. It's been precisely because political parties, and the African National Congress in particular, has been able to deploy people into key positions and make key administrative decisions inside departments, including the allocation of contracts, that the ANC has been able to play this gatekeeping role with regard to the state. And I think it's why the African National Congress in particular has attracted all sorts of people, very ambitious, seeking careers in the state, but as a way to gain and access larger resources in the state and in society. So that gatekeeping role has been made possible by the structure, and the legislative structure in particular, of our public administration. Some of us have been involved in work critiquing this arrangement for a long time now, discussing the way in which it's resulted in a whole range of dysfunctionality in government departments, and in some cases government failure. I've been arguing, and I think I've been arguing that it was the major conduit for the period of what we call state capture, a period during the Jacob Zuma period when the political party or factions of the African National Congress were able to deploy key people into key departments and to key positions in state-owned enterprises, and use those positions to restructure how public procurement happened, and to benefit and to reorient the award of large contracts to friends, family, and political networks. And that's all been possible not simply through cadre deployment of the African National Congress, but because the legislative structure has made that kind of action perfectly permissible. In 2022, 2023, we helped, together with senior officials in the Department of Public Service Administration, develop a reform or an amendment to the Public Service Act to try to instantiate a separation in law between political office and an administrative office. We developed a bill called the Public Service Amendment Bill. It passed in the National Assembly in 2024, rather incredibly, and in 2025, in November 2025, it passed in the National Council of Provinces. South Africa's got two houses of parliament. One of the houses is to allow for a representation from provincial administrations, provincial parliaments. So it was passed through the parliamentary cycle at the end of last year, and incredibly, on the 1st of April, as I mentioned, President Ramaphosa signed it into law. So we think we've scored a major historical breakthrough with regards to the organization of South Africa's public service. So let me tell you very briefly what the amendment does. First of all, it takes those administrative powers away from the politicians. So the power to recruit staff and the power to make operational decisions no longer vest with the political executive. Instead, those powers now rest with director generals and heads of departments. So for the first time in the last 30 years, since South Africa became a democracy, director generals will now have the original powers vested in their own offices to make key administrative decisions. They will no longer have to negotiate, convince, beg, in some cases, their political masters to grant them the authority to make a whole range of key decisions. And in this regard, it ends or interrupts very strongly the politicization of many of our administrations. It creates the foundation further for a more professional route into the public service. So rather a political route through discretion of the minister in the appointment process, but rather to start developing in South Africa a professional and merit-based appointment process into the public service. And in this regard, I think it's a fundamental shift in the organization of South Africa State. If you'll forgive me a second, if I have a little bit of time, It's as significant, I think, as the reforms in the United States at the end of the 19th century, implemented at the beginning of the 20th century by Roosevelt, and then after the Second World War by the second Roosevelt administration. It's as significant as the reforms in Europe after the Second World War. It's as significant as the reforms in Japan after the Second World War. These, I think, are a major, major change, and it's why I've called it the third transition. Let me conclude quickly by thinking how this is going to change elite contestation in South Africa, the trajectory of elite contestation. If the African National Congress or any political party no longer has the kinds of powers over the administration which the ANC has enjoyed over the last 30 years, it's going to redirect the way in which elites seek access to key resources in the state and in the economy. It will no longer be attractive for them simply to go into political parties and to see, because the political parties will no longer have access to, will no longer have the powers to deploy them into key positions. So I think what it's going to do is going to redirect a whole lot of elite contestation away from political parties. I think that's a very positive development if it happens. So I do think that what we're seeing is going to be seen as a consolidation and deepening of South Africa's parliamentary democracy, that the political parties will play a more conventionally political role in developing manifestos, competing with each other on the basis of the political programs which they stand for, rather than on their ability to access state resources and deploy their people into key positions in the state. So I think on the one hand, that's a very exciting and very healthy development around developing and consolidating South Africa's democracy. Having said that, I do think that if political parties are no longer the main route into access to the state, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to happily align with the new constitutional, the new legal situation. I do think associated with that as well is going to be an intensification of crime in South Africa. So I think if the political route to state resources begins to close down, I think there's going to be, and we're already seeing it, an intensification of organized and criminal activities in order to access those same resources. As we know, in South Africa, there is a parliamentary and a judicial inquiry into the police, and what it's revealing is the degree to which organized crime has absolutely penetrated and infiltrated the key and the most senior echelons of the South African police. So I think, and this is where I'll conclude, I think what we're seeing in South Africa is a paradoxical situation of the consolidation and deepening of South Africa's parliamentary democracy on the one hand, and on the other hand, a growing trend towards crime and organized crime. Finally, I think the Public Service Amendment Act is a fundamental piece of legislation. It's going to potentially improve the way our public administrations work, but I also think it's going to change the way in which elite contestation happens in South Africa going forward. And thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I haven't overrun my time too much.
That was absolutely perfect on time. Thank you so much, Ivor. We are now going to listen to Rorisang Lekalake, which will present a presentation on the public service reform and citizen perspectives across Africa. Please, Rorisang, you can also share your screen with us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the introduction. You are absolutely correct. I am joining from Cape Town today, and I have the pleasure of presenting a sort of continental view of what the state is currently on the ground when it comes to key public services in Africa. So my presentation is entitled The Delivery Gap, and it's specifically focusing on what citizen data, public opinion data can tell us about the state of public services in Africa. So to start off with, I'd like to very quickly introduce the organization and give a little bit of context about the data that I'll be sharing today, which comes from Afrobarometer, the organization where I work. So Afrobarometer is a Pan-African non-partisan survey research network, and our goal is to give African publics, so the citizens, a voice in policy and decision-making. So the surveys that we do are nationally representative, so it means we go to all parts of the country and try to sample our respondents in a way so that when we look at the data, it's representative of the whole country. I won't go into any details, but happy to answer any questions on methodology in the Q&A if people are interested. So when we do these interviews, they're done face-to-face in the language of the respondent's choice. And then we've also been collecting data for quite some time, so for over 25 years. And we just launched our latest round of surveys just last month. So this map is just to give you a sense of the coverage of Afrobarometer, so where we've done surveys. So we'll see that South Africa was included right from our very first round. So we have about 25 years of data from there. And then I know that another of our presenters is from Kenya. So Kenya is in the light blue, which shows that we've been doing surveys there since round 2. So we have quite wide coverage of the African continent, but not complete yet. It's something that we would love to do eventually. So at a glance, just to give you a brief preview of the results I'll be showing, I'll be giving some highlights from about 51,000 interviews that we conducted in 38 countries between 2024 and 2025. And they're coming from a report that some colleagues of mine wrote, and I will share the details of that for anyone who's interested. And I'll be highlighting 4 key themes. So firstly, citizen priorities and performance when it comes to public services. Secondly, access to essential household services and how that's changed over time and how it varies across countries. Thirdly, what citizens say about how easy or difficult it is to obtain key services in their countries. And then fourthly, experiences of corruption in getting delivery of public services when that is applicable. So I firstly wanted to start off with the question of what it is that citizens want. And in our view as Afrobarometer, we really view the citizens as experts in their own right. And one of the key questions that we ask in every survey round is asking citizens what they believe the most important problems facing their country are. So we allow them to choose up to 3 problems, and then this graph basically summarizes those responses. And as we can see in the dark purple, public services are a key, they dominate the citizens' agenda. So for example, health at 38% is the leading citizen priority on average across the 38 countries, followed fairly closely by employment and then education, inflation, infrastructure and roads, water supply, crime and security, electricity, etc. So as you can see, out of the top 10, public services account for about at least half of those priorities. Secondly, another key thing we do is ask how governments are performing on all of these different types of priorities. And as this short chart shows, the answer is not very well in many cases, at least on average. So what this chart is showing is the percentage of the citizens that we have surveyed who say that their governments are doing fairly well or very well on key public services, and that's represented by the green. And then or they're doing fairly badly or very badly, which is represented by the red. And as we can see, except for education, where people are quite mixed, we see that at least slight majorities of citizens are saying that their governments are doing badly or very badly on health, infrastructure, electricity, water and sanitation, and crime. And it's those latter 2, water and sanitation and crime, which have the highest rates of dissatisfaction at 60%. Now, some of this might definitely come in terms of citizens' actual experiences in accessing essential household services. And we believe that public opinion surveys provide very important complementary data to official statistics about access, particularly when it comes to remote areas where it might be harder to have data collection. So what this first chart shows is access to piped water in the electric grid across the 38 countries that we did surveys in. So the first column on the left is showing the percentage of citizens who reported having access to piped water in the form of either a community water system or piped water in their dwelling or their yard. And as we can see there, it's just under half at 49%. Across the 38 countries. And then secondly, on the right in the orange is showing the percentage of citizens who reported being connected to the national grid. And there we see that access is higher at 60% on average. Now, one key area where we see very large differences when we start breaking down those statistics by different groups is that we see that there are large disparities in access across urban and rural areas. So urban areas in this chart are represented by the purple and rural by the yellow. And as we can see, when it comes to connection to the national electric grid, we see huge disparities here, where around 8 in 10 citizens who live in urban areas are connected, compared to only around 4 in 10 in rural areas. And similarly, we see that 2/3 of urbanites have access to piped water, whilst only 3 in 10 have this access in rural areas. I also just want to highlight that we do see very large differences by country in access to services. So as this chart is showing, very, very wide disparities in connection to the electric grid specifically, which ranges from only around 14% of citizens in Malawi, compared to near universal access to these services in Mauritius and Seychelles. And then I've highlighted South Africa and Kenya in green just to also show, since it's relevant to the conversation here. So in South Africa, that was 82% of citizens reported access to the grid, compared to 64% in Kenya. And then I also want to highlight, for the sake of time, I won't show it here, that we find similar wide range of differences when we look at access to piped water and other types of infrastructure as well. Now, I also wanted to just highlight the fact that survey data has proven to be quite useful in capturing the lived experience between some of these statistics in infrastructure and the gap between and lived experience in terms of what citizens actually receive. So what this chart does is it takes that past statistics that you saw, and then it breaks it down in terms of what our respondents told us about the reliability of connections to the electric grid. So on average, what we find is that only 43% of the people who are connected to the grid say that they have electricity most or all the time, while 7% said that it was available around half the time, and then a further 11% said never or only occasionally. And so I also wanted to just highlight how this can provide quite important nuance to some of these figures. So if we look, for example, at Comoros and Sao Tome and Principe, they both have similar rates of connectivity to the grid, but 75% of citizens in Sao Tome enjoy electricity most or all the time, compared to only 31% in Comoros. And similarly, if we look at Botswana and Nigeria, we have similar rates of connectivity, but once we start looking at reliability, we see very different results. Where 64% of those who are connected to the grid in Botswana enjoy it all or most of the time, compared to only 10% in Nigeria. So next, I'd like to turn to what our respondents said about the quality of public service interactions. And firstly, I'd like to just provide some context to just share the fact that not everybody that we surveyed actually had contact with public service providers. So as this chart shows, contact with public clinics or hospitals had the highest rates of contact, with around 61% across the 38 countries, whilst around 4 in 10 respondents said that they had encountered the police in one form or another. 37% had tried to obtain an identity document in the past year, and then 13% had specifically requested assistance from the police. So with that in mind, the next charts show what happened amongst the citizens who did have contact. And what we found is that they were fairly split in terms of how easy or difficult it was to access those public services. So in this chart, we're showing easy and very easy using the blue, and difficult, very difficult in the red. And what we see, as I mentioned, is that it's quite split between those who found it easy to do so and those who found it difficult in terms and specifically those who tried to access identity documents, medical care, and assistance from the police. Now, once again, once we break it down by country, the picture starts looking quite complex. And what this table is showing is a country level view of what we found. And just to give a little bit of context, the green is kind of highlighting, good figures because we're looking at difficulty of accessing public services. So these are countries in which between 0 and 25% of citizens said that they found it difficult to do so. Yellow represents the next 25 to 50%, and then the red is when we have difficulty rates at 50% or above. And so unfortunately, what we see is quite a lot of red, quite a lot of yellow, and only a few kind of bright spots where they're green. So if I focus specifically, for example, on the difficulty of obtaining an identity document, citizens in Botswana, Cabo Verde, and Seychelles said that they found it only quite easy. Only small percentages said it was difficult. And the same with obtaining medical care in Mauritius, but those are the only green areas. So it's really highlighting the countries in which some reform may definitely be needed in those specific sectors. And then perhaps more concerningly, we also are able to look at, using the data, the percentage of citizens who reported having to pay a bribe in order to obtain a public service. And what we find, at least in our data, is that bribery or reported bribery was most prevalent in interactions with the police, with roughly a third of those who encountered the police or wanted to avoid a problem with the police reported having to pay a bribe at least once. But it extends fairly high rate, or what I would consider to be concerningly high rates, across identity documents and medical care as well. And of course, I do want to preface this with the fact that these figures may be underestimates, since bribery is a very sensitive behavior that respondents tend to underreport even in confidential face-to-face surveys like the ones that we do in Afrobarometer. And then lastly, if we narrow again to looking at the country level view of reported bribery, we find that the picture is quite mixed again. We have countries like Botswana, Cabo Verde, and Seychelles, again, showing very low rates of reported bribery across all 4 areas that we looked at, whilst other countries had more red spots, as we kind of are showing it. And we find that even though like I mentioned, this is a very sensitive thing, and it can be difficult to get respondents to disclose this kind of behavior, we actually find that majorities are reporting having to pay bribes in the most affected countries. So for instance, it's up to 83% for police assistance in Liberia and 62% for medical care in Sierra Leone. So when you look at this picture, it suggests that at least in some contexts, corruption may not be the exception and instead the norm, and therefore people feel quite comfortable disclosing when they have these issues. And again, the citizen data is showing areas in which urgent reform would be needed. And then lastly, I will just very quickly, as I mentioned, for those who are interested in reading the full report, which goes into many more details that I didn't go into for the sake of time here. There is a full report, and this QR code will link to that report in both English on the left and French on the right. But as I mentioned, I would welcome any questions on any of these figures and anything else in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rorisang, for being so punctual. It was a lovely presentation. I have so many questions already, but I'm going to ask Jacob Nato to start his presentation, and then we can jump to the discussion after him. I have his presentation here, Jacob. I will share my screen, and then you can start whenever you want.
Okay, thank you so much, participants. My name is Jacob Nato. I am from Nairobi, Kenya. So greetings to you all from Nairobi. And it's a pleasure to have you this day. So I think the topic I would like to focus on this afternoon is on the professionalization of the public service in Kenya. And I think my presentation is not very far from what my earlier colleagues have already spoken about. So you are likely to see some areas of convergence from what they have already spoken about. So I can't see it on my side, but I think I can open my presentation. Yes,
Yeah,
so
I think the public can see it. You just let me know when you want me to change the slides and it will work perfectly. Thank you.
okay, thank you. So on slide 2, just basically the outline of what we want to focus on. So briefly, we'll take you through the dilemma that we believe is facing the public service in Africa, and also just to have a picture of how the performance of our public service in Africa is vis-a-vis the global picture. And despite the picture that we are going to portray, we really want to mention that there are quite a number of reforms that have taken place in the continent, which offer a promise to the public service. And the fourth item, we shall then see what can we do as a continent so that we can embrace professionalism in our public service. And finally, we shall give you a little focus from Kenya about what we are doing to enhance our performance and also our productivity of the public service. So next slide, please. Yes, so in terms of the dilemma that we face as a continent of Africa, I think our colleague Rose has really painted a very good picture of how the Afrobarometer has been able to show the general status or the public perception about public services in Africa. And I think we will all agree that the picture is relatively grim, not very encouraging, but later on in the presentation, we shall show a few slides that will be able to demonstrate that there is promise. So as Rose has said, so that I don't repeat what she has said, we notice that there are significant disparities in access to public services by the citizens. And the citizens have also demonstrated that they face ongoing difficulties for them to secure or even to access crucial services. And also the problem of corruption is still prevalent in the African continent, which means that the professionalism of our public service is yet to reach the level that is expected. So as much as governments in Africa are trying to offer services as much as they can, but I think one thing that is coming out very clearly is that we are still not meeting the expectations that the citizens would wish to have. And therefore, our service delivery is not yet at the optimum level. For example, a recent report also by the Good Governance Africa also shows that quite a number of countries in Africa have a problem of budgeted corruption, which means that as much as they prepare the national budgets and they try to make them as transparent as possible, but somehow they include items inside there which are clearly very easy towards to enhance corruption. So the report also shows that issues of nepotism in public service are still there. Fraud issues in procurement are still there, and also issues of overpayment. So I think the rest of the issues have already been dealt by Rose. So I think then we can move to the next slide. Yes, thank you. So therefore, how have we performed as Africa in terms of our public service vis-a-vis how the globe is performing? So one of the common indices that I've also been able to come across is the Blavatnik Index of Public Administration. I think the latest one was 2024. And this index actually measures the effectiveness of a country's public administrations in four main domains. The first one being leadership and strategy. The second one being public policy. The third one being the delivery of services by countries. And finally, the fourth domain being the people and also processes. So what is surprising with this index is that African countries are really not performing very well on that index. For example, the overall leaders in that broad index are countries from the developed world. We have Denmark, Finland, Norway, Canada, Singapore, and the USA. So these are the top 5 countries in a public administration. But now when you focus on, I decided to focus specifically on sub-Saharan Africa. Forgive me for that. I think Mauritius was 34th. Then Kenya was actually ranked 62nd in the world. And then Rwanda and South Africa, they actually tied at 69. And then Benin, Botswana, and Zambia at 73rd. So I think what comes out clearly from this ranking is that as a continent, we still really need to pull up our socks so that we are able to also rank above the top peers in the globe. So thank you. We can go to the next slide. Yes, so as much as we are saying that the continent has not performed very well in terms of the public service, I think we just want to give some ray of hope that not all is lost. Countries are really undertaking quite a number of reforms, and therefore we believe that if these reforms are well implemented, well monitored, then countries should be able to achieve better performance in their public services. So maybe just to mention some of the key reforms that have taken place, we've seen many African countries actually now transforming towards digitalization of their public services, just to ensure that there is that digital transformation. And a good example in Kenya is what is called the e-citizen portal, which has about 1,000 public services on that portal. So you don't need to go walking to offices physically, asking them to offer you various services. Once you log into the portal and you access the service that you require, you pay the requisite fees and you are able to go home scot-free. So also, we've seen a growing trend towards decentralization of public services. Like, for example, the shift towards devolution. I think it's not only Kenya, but quite a number of African countries have now moved towards a devolved system of government, where we have the subnational county, or even what we call the county governments, which also have their separate public service boards. And this, we believe, helps to bring services closer to the people. Then a third reform, which we believe is quite useful, is that we have seen a growing trend by African countries now to really instill performance and productivity in culture into their public service. So they are focusing on, are you productive? Are you performing to expectations? And also they are focusing on results-based management. For example, a framework that we have in many African countries, including Kenya, is what is called the performance-based contracting. So here, all ministries, all departments, all agencies actually sign a performance contract with the government. And actually, that performance contract is evaluated at the end of the financial year. And even a score is given to the various ministries, departments, and agencies in terms of their productivity index score. So we believe this is quite a good move towards helping us to assure a public service in Africa that is quite productive and performs well. Then another reform, which we believe is quite useful, is like, for example, in Kenya, I may not know what is happening in the other countries. Yeah, sorry about the noise from outside, but countries have now started linking their public services to the national priorities that the government has. So, for example, when the government comes to power, they have a manifesto or a strategic plan that they wish to achieve. So we are gradually seeing public service servants being asked to link their day-to-day operations with the national priorities. So, and even a reporting structure has been put in place. For example, in Kenya, for every public servant, just to demonstrate how the work you do on a day-to-day basis translates to the broader national priorities. And we believe this is a good move. But as Ivor, I think Ivor mentioned this in the first presentation, we need to be very careful so that there is no political interference with the public service, because the public service really needs to be completely apolitical so that they deliver on what they need to deliver. And last but not least, which we believe is quite a good reform that will help to transform our public service, we are also seeing increasing trends towards participatory governance, whereby the government actually engages directly with the citizens on various issues. Yeah, sorry for the noise from outside. But for example, a good platform in Kenya is called the Bonga na Gava platform. Sorry, this is a Swahili word, but basically what it means is that citizens are given an opportunity to interact freely with the government, to tell them things they like and things they don't like. So we believe with all these reforms, then the continent is positioned to develop much better. So next slide, please. Yes, so therefore now the big question in the room then becomes how can we as a continent enhance the professionalism of our public service? And we believe there are 4 key takeaways that we believe if we are able to instill these issues in our public service, then our public service is likely to be positioned on a better trajectory. So this according to a study by the OECD, and they showed that first of all, values-based leadership is very important, so that all public servants in their day-to-day work, they are able to observe high standards of accountability, integrity, ethical behavior, and transparency. And then a second item is the issue of open inclusion, which means that even as you do your day-to-day work, you need to be well versed with what the common citizen would like to see. I think the presentation by Rose also spoke briefly about this one, so that at the end of the day, we know that it is the citizen that we are trying to serve. So you are doing your work with the citizen in mind, so that you offer better services to the satisfaction of your citizens, your colleagues, even your employees, and ensuring that you observe diversity for better outcomes. And then the third angle, which we believe can be quite useful, is organizational stewardship, which means that the leaders in organizations need to create a favorable working environment for their employees. So ensure that they have the right skills, the right tools, and even the relevant rewards and the relevant sanctions, and just generally building their capacity to be able to achieve what they need to achieve. And last but not least is the importance of soft skills. I think many public servants, they suffer from this problem. Like they have the technical skills. Like me as an economist, I have the technical skills of an economist. An engineer has the technical skills of an engineer. A doctor has the technical skills of a doctor. But now when it comes to soft skills, which means dealing with people, sometimes it becomes the bottleneck. So I think these are some of the good areas we can focus on. So finally, next slide, please. I think this should be our last slide. So maybe just to focus on Kenya, I apologize for this. I know we come from various countries in Africa, but I thought it would be wise just to give you a flavor of what is happening in Kenya. So we recently had our first national conference last week, and the conference was titled Productivity and Performance in the Public Service. And there were 4 major takeaways that came up from that conference, which I thought would be good to share with all of us. So there was emphasis on performance over presence. So what the leaders in Kenya want now to push is instead of just focusing on being there from 8 to 5 o'clock, which is presence, they want to focus more on performance. How much are you able to deliver for the people? And then another good area is merit-based competition. So the leaders in that conference came up with a resolution that now merit will be the determinant for reward, for compensation, and even for career progression. So one really has to work very hard so that they are able to get the relevant compensation or rewards, and even to get promotions and so on. So that means that performance is now going to be tied to the key performance indicators. Then the third item is digital transformation and artificial intelligence. I think we want now to leverage on AI so that the country is able to develop much better, not really to lose jobs, but to leverage on AI so that it can help us to do tasks which can be done more efficiently through technology. And last but not least is having sector-specific objectives. Here, every sector will be required to have the specific objectives it wishes to achieve, and therefore all the workers under that sector will be able to in one way or another support or contribute towards the achievement of those strategic objectives at a sector level. So thank you very much. I think maybe just to conclude is that despite the problems we are facing as an African continent, I think there is hope given that the reforms that are taking place, but we need to empower especially the ministries of public service, and even for many countries, their public service commissions, so that they are able to achieve a public service that is performance driven, that is productive, and even the public servants are happy to work in the various institutions that they work. So thank you very much for this time, and we look forward to the interactions that will come thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. So now hopefully we can start with the discussion, questions from the audience. I will open the floor for questions. If you have any comments, please let us know in the comments. We can read your comments, or you can briefly tell us what are your thoughts. So you can raise your hand using the raise hand feature here at Microsoft Teams. The floor is yours. If someone else wants to make any question.
Perhaps, Rafael, we could have a chance just as the panel just to engage a little bit with each other's papers.
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much for those presentations and giving a broader Africa perspective. The Afrobarometer work is hugely instructive and revealing. And Jacob, the reforms in Kenya, I think, are hugely important. And this is why I think what's happening in South Africa is interesting. To some extent, we're catching up with some of the reform initiatives that are happening on the other parts of the African continent. I've been following developments in Ghana and also very important developments happening in Nigeria. In some senses, several steps ahead of what's going on in South Africa. And I think it's when you talk about those various indices, the Blavatnik indices, and you mentioned the sort of leadership of traditional Western European countries at the top, and African countries generally tending to be at the bottom in those regards. I'm a little skeptical of those indices, but there's one element though that I do think that they've got right, which is a distinguishing element. Where they, I think, I've got things right is that they have very firmly, or often very firmly, distinguished between political office and administrative office. And in this regard, I think the US is going in the opposite direction under Trevor, under Donald Trump. What made America great is what he's undoing, and that was the civil service reforms of the late 19th century and early 20th century under Roosevelt's first and second administration, which was to begin to bring an end to Tammany Hall politics in the US, which was this extreme politicization of the US civil service, by introducing a distinction between political office and administrative office. And I really do think those reforms are what made America great in the 20th century. I think Western Europe has been advanced in institutionalizing that distinction, as has Asia in the late 20th century, 21st century. I think one of the issues that hobbles African public administrations is that we often obscure the distinction between political office and administrative office, that we grant our politicians too many functions which are ostensibly administrative functions, so that there is a blurring of the lines. And I think this is why I mentioned and focused on the Public Service Amendment Act in South Africa. And I know that Kenya is ahead of us in this regard and doing important work. As is Nigeria, interestingly enough, in some areas. Whether it's implemented or not, that's a separate story. But around taking away from the politicians a whole range of administrative functions. So I thought these reforms comparatively are hugely interesting. So thank you.
Thanks, Ivor. I don't know if Rorisang or Jacob want to comment. But I'm checking if we have comments from the audience. So we have some comments I will share with you. The first comment say that regarding the South African context, that the new laws are welcomed, but it's important that the new heads of department have the power to make it happen. The implementation, which is something that we discuss a lot at NSI, now is the biggest and the more complex part of the reform, that the reform needs to be enforced, and the importance of the enforcement of these new laws. Also that if we can have some clarity of the inclusion of municipal services in the research outcomes. This is, I think it's a question for Jacob or Rorisang. Also, how can AI could assist us in fast-tracking policy implementation? Those are very interesting comments. From my side, I think it was very interesting to hear from Rorisang this data from across the continent, because it also shows us how public service reform. I mean, here nowadays I'm based in Berlin, in Germany, and there's a growing conversation on how public administration reform can enhance democratic stability. because the bad quality of public services in Germany, many see as one of the roots for the disengagement with the democracy, the representative democracy. And in the case of Africa and Latin America, I think that the disengagement with public services was the norm, and the quality, the growing quality of public services in some contexts, not always translate into more trust in democracy. So I think that there's a challenge here, that it's a different challenge in different countries. So I don't know, my question to Rorisang is to know if there is data available across the continent showing where the positive evaluation of public services does have impact in the trust in democratic institutions, or if this is not something that we can see across the continent. I think it would be very interesting to see if those things are related or not in countries in the region. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Maybe I can start. Thank you so much for the wonderful questions. I think they are a bit complex, but I'll try as much as possible to respond. So thanks so much, Ivor. I think you've really brought up a very good idea on the issue of the blood phenolic index. I think what we'd like to concur with you is that even that index, we are not saying it is the best that can there be, but I think when you look at indices that rank public services across the whole world, I think you'll not come across so many. Like in Africa, we have the Afrobarometer that Rory here works for. But now at a global level, there are very few, like the Blavittnik Index and a few others. But I think what I totally want to agree with you is that there is need for the separation of functions between the political office and the administrative office. And even in Kenya, I think we also face more or less a similar problem, whereby you find a function that would have been undertaken, let's say, by the Ministry of Health, for example, is being taken up by maybe the office of the president or any other political office. But I think we totally agree with you that there is need to have that separation, and the administrative functions are best left to the administrators because they have the knowledge, they have the institutional memory. So what they only need is the facilitation from the political class in terms of budgeting and so on. So I think we totally agree with you on that. Then on the question of artificial intelligence, yes, I think this is now the new norm that we are facing. AI is being leveraged by countries to help them achieve objectives maybe more efficiently and maybe much faster. But I think the worry that many people normally have is that if we leverage on technology, people are likely to lose their jobs. So that is not the position we are trying to hold. We are just trying to say that if there are functions that AI can help us leverage on to improve our efficiency, to improve our service delivery, and even policy implementation, I think that will be the way to go. But of course, preserving jobs, because we really want those jobs to be preserved. Then maybe the last question, so that I give my colleagues also to give their views, is yes, thank you. I think I like this question of how we can include municipal services in research outcomes. Actually, I come from a research institution. KIPPRA is basically a research institution. And for us, we work very closely with the subnational governments. Like, for example, in Kenya, we refer to them as county governments, because we realize that research needs to be all-inclusive. So we cannot just sit in Nairobi, do the work alone, and then send them the results. I think that is not proper. So actually, we do engage them proactively in all our research processes, so that by the end of the study, maybe when we are delivering the results, they are also able to own up the results, because at the end of the day, they are the implementers of the findings. Yeah, so thank you very much. Happy for those questions. And thank you, colleagues.
Thank you. Is it okay if I go next, Ivor?
Yes, please.
Please.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for the questions. Really great questions. So I think, just to add on like a few, maybe 2 cents on the question of indices, I think for a quantitative social scientist like myself, this is an area where we could talk for ages on this. But I think, I agree, it's every single measure has kind of strong suits and weak points. So I think just to add my opinion that I think the strongest research comes when you're able to kind of leverage across different indices and different ways of measuring things, because some are expert surveys, some is objective data, some might be public opinion. So I think the exciting thing is, even though we don't have maybe quite so many global indices, there are more and more indices that are coming out, and there seems to be interest in trying to find ways to rigorously measure this. And I think if I use the concept of democracy as an example, I think we've seen over time an evolution from Freedom House and the such likes to something like VDEM, which really is trying to do something very rigorous. So hopefully it will also occur in this dimension. And I think that growing focus from policymakers will help drive that. And then secondly, thank you so much, Raphael, for your wonderful question on the link between public service delivery and democratic systems. I think this is something that's very important and something that as Afrobarometer we've focused on, because I think we are all aware of the fact that we're in the midst of a global democratic recession, at least on the aggregate level and in many countries. And so as Afrobarometer, this democracy and democratic governance specifically is really our bread and butter. And so this is something that we've definitely kept our eye on. And so we do have a 2024 report on the state of democracy in Africa. And what we did was we looked at 2 different dimensions of kind of democratic attitudes. So firstly, the extent to which people were satisfied with the way democracy was being delivered. And then secondly, whether they support democracy, because it's not quite the same thing. We kind of view it as kind of a supply-demand issue. And when we looked basically at the relationship between economic indicators, including public service delivery, and political indicators, what we found is that satisfaction with democracy was very responsive to both sets of factors. So if you're seeing economic deterioration and political deterioration, you see a deterioration in satisfaction with democracy. We were interested to find that support is much more resilient to economic factors, such as perceptions that the economy is doing badly, but it's really political issues that start to erode support for democracy, and that includes perceived corruption in public administration and among political leaders. And then if I may kind of use South Africa as an anecdotal case, when I first started working for Afrobarometer and we looked at the relationship between trust and democratic outcomes, what we saw was at the time, I think that was around 2014, it was really an erosion in leaders that was happening. And that then translated about 5 to 10 years later into no longer trusting institutions. And now our latest data show that South Africans, the majority, no longer support democracy above alternatives and actually are quite open to military rule and others. So I think that also shows how it can be this slow erosion over time. So thank you again for the question.
Thank you so much. That's super interesting, Rorisang. Ivor, I will ask you to be short in your answer because we have 2 people from the audience with questions, and I would like to ask them to make the questions together so we have a time to have a new round of comments from the speakers. So how do you prefer to follow?
Just a quick observation that I mean, I've seen that Afrobarometer report about South Africa's growing penchant for military rule and dictatorship, which is, of course, deeply, deeply concerning. And given the very, very low voter registration levels in South Africa. That does seem to support that argument. And yet at the same time, and this is why the reforms which I mentioned are happening now, in a different movement, or a movement in a different direction, is that government performance has become an electoral issue in South Africa over the last couple of years, which means the ANC's decline electorally is strongly related to the perception and the reality of how it's performed in government. And I think that's a very positive development in that regard. So parts of our political system are beginning to send the right kinds of signals, especially in regard to administration and the performance of government. So I would say that's encouraging, although I agree South Africa's growing penchant for military rule is rather terrifying.
Thank you, Ivor. So please, Dr. Malabela and also Paresh Maharaj, I would ask each of you to tell us your questions and comments, and then we can have a final round of comments from our speakers. So please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. My name is Musawenkosi Malabela, and I'm a researcher at NEHAU. And my question, and thanks for the wonderful presentations and enlightenment from Jacob, Rorisang, and Prof. Chipkin. Prof. Chipkin, on some of the issues that Jacob raised, he raised the issue about budgeted corruption, and I just want you to get your sense of how this affects us here at home in South Africa. And then on one of the issues that you mentioned is the elite contestation that are going to be affected by the new Public Service Act of 2025. Because one of the things that I'm interested in is this patronage networks that has been formed, which are now going to be disrupted by politicians not having access to some of these administrative powers of hiring and firing of these of some of these people in key positions, because I think we are going to see some form of a tug of war or a turf war between these two, and it might affect service delivery, because you'll find ministers or politicians in political offices fighting with DGs or those who are responsible for the admin in the forms of DGs and HODs, because I think that turf of war is going to, in some way, going to happen because of the fact, especially for the old guard that has been in the system and have been using some of these positions for patronage, and for them to retain their positions in their parties and all of those things, because it's like you are taking something that's really a resource for them, a resource tool and which actually helps them to advance politically. So if I can get your views on that, and thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, and if possible, they can be shared with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will read the last comment that we had. It's about the South African context. It says, what is the institutional readiness of South Africa public institutions for professionalization? This question is in light of the other previous laws and regulations aimed at reforming the public service that we have had, yet there are still challenges of compliance and oversight. What is the difference now, and what will we do differently? I think it's a great question. So please, I will ask our speakers to do a last final round of comments and also conclusions. We are almost on time to close this conversation, this lovely conversation. I will give the word to Ivor, and then Rorisang, and then Jacob. Okay, Ivor, please.
So one of the things which is worth observing, and thank you for the question from the person from NEHAU. NEHAU, of course, is one of South Africa's major trade unions, is that in the South African context, the reason we were able to advance these reforms as far as we did was through huge support from the COSATU unions, which strongly backed the passing of the Public Service Amendment Act, especially in the provincial legislatures. So they got behind it, and partly I think it's because they've understood the progressive value of these reforms. Many of our public servants are endlessly stigmatized as corrupt and stupid and incompetent when institutions fail, where some of those institutional failures are unrelated to the personal qualities of the public servants, and is often related to the the composition of the department structurally, as I was discussing. So I think the challenge now going forward, though, is the implementation, and Jacob and Rorisang, it would be very interesting to see the African perspective in this regard. How one implements. What we're going to be doing is we anticipate, as the colleague from the trade unions mentioned, that there's going to be lots of attempts to game or maliciously comply with the legislation, or comply with it in a way that is perhaps legal but subverts its spirit. And there are all sorts of back doors. We're going to prepare. We're busy working on a series of regulations which anticipates the way in which the legislation will be gamed, or the legislation will be maliciously complied with, to prevent such malicious compliance. So that's the move forward. I didn't fully understand the question about budgeting, but Jacob, maybe that's something you can take up in your response. Just again, final note to say thank you very much for the seminar. I think it's been incredibly enlightening, and I've enjoyed very much listening to the other presentations. And thank you to Raphael for your excellent chairing of this session. So thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Ivor. Rorisang, please.
Thank you, Raphael. And I also just want to echo my thanks for the invitation to present today, and my appreciation for my co-panelists' presentations. And with that, I think in terms of last thoughts, I want to pull, directly from what Jacob said, and to highlight the fact that there is hope, even though it there can be, when you start looking at reality, it can look quite grim. But there are areas of improvement and areas of light. I think I tried to highlight a few of those, and more can be seen in our full report in terms of countries in which we see improvements over time, for instance. And I think that's really, the key takeaway for me when it comes to data like this, that I think it's important to try reach across and try to present to governments and to public administrators. In some countries they're open, and others they aren't. And I think it's because sometimes there's the sense that civil society kind of exists only to critique the government, rather than to kind of partner and work towards the same goal. So I think if there's a way to break down some of these barriers, to show that, data like this is really just pointing to areas of potentially mutual effort to improve things. And, ultimately, it's really the citizens that all of this is about, where we might see reforms start to happen and actually start becoming effective. But thank you very much again for the opportunity to share these thoughts.
Thank you so much, Rorisang. It was a pleasure. And please, Jacob, you can finish our conversation.
Thank you very much, Raphael, for the good sharing. And also, I join my colleagues to say thank you for this opportunity. And I think I've also enjoyed the presentations from my two colleagues. So thank you most sincerely. Yes, so the question of budgeted corruption, I think from that study that was done by Good Governance Africa, they've even tried to show some specific examples of how this can happen. But maybe if I can just give a very simple example. For example, in many budgets, not just in Kenya, I believe, but across many African countries, you'll be able to see a budget line or a budget vote called what is it called? There's a name I'm looking for, but a common name they'll call is entertainment. So normally when you look at that line called entertainment, it's just a simple line, entertainment, and usually it is given a huge amount of budgetary allocation. And usually not many people are able even to see that in their budget line. So not many people will question. But there are some lines in the budget which you can clearly see that it is really not meant for improving service delivery, but maybe just to benefit a few people who are interested in getting the money. But I'm sure if you do maybe some more background reading from that report, you'll be able to see how they have been able to demonstrate more adequately how African countries budget corruption as they prepare their budgets. And we feel this is something that is taking us back as a continent, because these are simply resources that are lost that would have otherwise been used to take us forward as a continent. Then the issue of political patronage, I think Ivor has responded to this. I think also Rory also tried to respond on the same, but I think it's a problem facing many countries where you find leaders, for example, who are defeated in the last elections. They come through what is called the back door. So the head of state or the president actually reappoints them in various positions. Like, let's say if you are a governor or a senator of a county, then maybe after the elections, you don't retain your seat. Normally they are brought back. So because of political patronage and political interference, it interferes with the professionalization of the public service. So I think as Rory says, there is some ray of light at the end, but as a continent, we still have to do a lot to ensure that our public service reaches the levels of Singapore, Finland, Denmark, and the other developed countries. So thank you all, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Jacob. So I'm going to close our conversation right now. We are almost on time, only 5 minutes late. It's a great pleasure. I'm just want to share also that we are going to share the presentations and the recording of this meeting in our website. So also we will ask and call everyone to subscribe to our newsletter at the nsi.org.ca. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much, Rorisang, Jacob, and Ivor. And yeah, thank you so much. Have a lovely afternoon.